On the first day of May, 1945, soldiers of the 36th Infantry Division walked into a requisitioned house in the Bavarian town of Bad Tölz and found an old man in a field marshal's uniform. He was 69 years old. His name was Karl Rudolf Gerd von Rundstedt, and for most of the previous 3 years he had been the senior German soldier in the West, the man Hitler reached for whenever the Western Front needed a steady hand and a famous name. He had commanded the defence of France on the day of the Normandy landings. He had commanded again through the autumn battles on the German border, through the Ardennes gamble, and through the loss of everything west of the Rhine. Now he had a weak heart, a captured country, and a great deal of time to think about how it had all come apart. His American captors questioned him over the following days. He suffered a heart attack early in the process and was handed to British custody. But before that, and afterward, in a long string of interrogations that stretched across the next 2 years, Rundstedt gave the Allies his own account of the defeat in the West. He named more than one cause. He talked about the air. He talked about fuel. And he kept returning, with a kind of professional bitterness, to a single specific thing that an outsider might not expect a field marshal to dwell on. He said that by the end, the Germans could no longer move trains. He did not mean it as a small administrative complaint. He meant it as the heart of the matter. An American intelligence bulletin published in March of 1946 recorded his explanation, and the sentence his interrogators remembered best was blunt and almost despairing. The root of the whole trouble, he told them, was air power. Air power. And the way that air power had reached down and broken him was through the rails. He said that toward the end it had become impossible to bring a single railroad train across the Rhine. Think about what that sentence is actually claiming. An army does not run on courage. It runs on coal and bread and shells and replacement tank engines, and in 1944 almost none of that moved by truck. It moved by rail. A German division on the Western Front was tied by a steel cord back to the factories of the Ruhr and the marshalling yards of the Rhineland, and that cord was the railway. Cut it, and the bravest soldiers in the world are reduced to what they can carry on their backs. Rundstedt was telling his interrogators that the Americans and the British had found a way to cut the cord, not in one place, where it could be spliced and the trains sent on again, everywhere, and all at once, and faster than any repair crew on Earth could close the brakes. This is the part of the war that gets left out of the films, because there is nothing cinematic about a freight schedule. There are no last stands in this story, no ridge held to the last man. There is instead a slow, deliberate, continent-wide act of strangulation, carried out over a year by men in cockpits and men with slide rules, and at the end of it, the strongest army in Europe could not get its tanks to the front. How do you take a railway away from an army? That is the story. And it begins, as so many American stories of this war begin, with an argument among men who were on the same side. If you are still with me a few minutes in, a quiet thank you, and a like helps this kind of history reach the people who care about it. The argument was about what to bomb. By the early months of 1944, the Allies had built an air force of a size the world had never seen, thousands of heavy bombers and thousands of fighters based in England, and the invasion of France was coming. Before any of it could be aimed at the railways, though, one prior thing had to be settled, and it was settled in the last week of February 1944, in the series of battles the airmen later called Big Week. For 6 days, the American heavy bombers deliberately went after the German aircraft industry, and just as deliberately used themselves as bait to draw the Luftwaffe fighters up into a fight with the long-range American escorts. It was a costly, grinding week, and at the end of it, the balance in the air over Germany had tipped. The German fighter force never fully recovered. The military historian Williamson Murray made the point that everything else the Allied air forces did in 1944, the rail campaign included, rested on that foundation. Command of the daylight sky was the precondition. Without it, a fighter-bomber hunting a locomotive over Germany would itself have been the hunted. With that won, the real question came to the table at Eisenhower's headquarters. With the invasion approaching, where should all that weight of bombs be aimed to do the German war machine the most harm? There were 2 serious answers, and the men behind them did not much like each other's plans. The first answer was oil. The American bomber generals, and above all Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz, who commanded the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, believed the war could be shortened by going after Germany's synthetic fuel plants. Spartz was a hard, spare, chain-smoking Pennsylvanian, born in Boyertown in 1891, and he had a cold logic on his side. Strangle the fuel, he argued, and you do not just slow the German army. You ground the Luftwaffe, you freeze the panzers, and you force the German fighters up into the air to defend the refineries, where the escort fighters can destroy them. Spartz submitted his formal case in early March of 1944. His deputy for operations, Major General Frederick Anderson, backed him. The second answer was the railways. Its champion was the British airman Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy at Supreme Headquarters, and behind Tedder stood an unlikely figure, a South African-born zoologist named Solly Zuckerman. Zuckerman had spent the previous year in the Mediterranean studying what bombs actually did to a rail network. He had watched the air campaigns against the Italian island of Pantelleria, against Sicily, against the Italian mainland, and he had counted the wreckage afterward with a scientist's patience. He had reached a conclusion that ran against instinct. The way to wreck a railway was not to chase individual trains, and it was not even to drop bridges. It was to smash the marshalling yards and the locomotive repair shops, the great mechanical hearts where trains were assembled, sorted, serviced, and sent out again. Destroy those, Zuckerman argued, and the whole system would seize up from the inside, slowly at first, and then all at once. What was on Eisenhower's desk in March of 1944 was therefore not a simple choice between two good options. It was a choice between two theories of how a modern industrial state could be brought down, and the cost of getting it wrong would be measured in the lives of the men who would wade ashore in Normandy. Each side could point to real weaknesses in the other's plan, and each side did, sharply. The oil men warned that rail damage could be repaired quickly, that the Germans were superb at patching track and bridging gaps, and that bombing French rail yards would do nothing to help on the morning of the invasion itself. The transportation men answered that the oil plants were deep inside Germany, that they were few and savagely defended, and that the payoff from hitting them would come too slowly to matter for the landings. Both arguments were partly right. That is what made the choice so hard. And there was a darker objection, one that had nothing to do with military efficiency. The marshalling yards Zuckerman wanted to hit were not out in empty country. They sat in the middle of French and Belgian towns, ringed by the houses of the railwaymen and their families. To bomb the yards was to kill those families. The British government understood this with painful clarity. Bomber Command warned that the campaign might cause somewhere between 80,000 and 160,000 French casualties, a quarter of them dead. Winston Churchill recoiled from it. In early April, he told his defense committee that he would not be a party to the butchery of large numbers of helpless French people, and he wrote to President Roosevelt to plead the case. Roosevelt's reply on May 11, 1944, was a hard one. However regrettable the loss of civilian life, he said, he would impose no military restrictions on the operations. The plan would go forward. The decision itself came at a meeting on March 25, 1944, at Eisenhower's forward headquarters. Tedder and the transportation plan carried the day. The argument that finally settled it was not really about which target mattered more in the abstract. It was about who controlled the bombers and what they could actually accomplish before June. Eisenhower had already made plain how much this mattered to him. 3 days earlier, he had told his subordinates that if the question of air command were not resolved in his favor, he would ask to be relieved of his command. A supreme commander does not threaten to resign over a small thing. He threatened it over this, because he understood that the railways of France were the road the German reinforcements would have to travel to reach the beaches, and he meant to tear that road up before his men ever set foot on the sand. There is a number that puts the whole decision in perspective, and it comes from the accounting the Americans did after the war. Across the entire Anglo-American bombing effort, transportation targets received about 32% of all the bombs dropped. Oil received about 9%. When you see those two figures side by side, you are looking at the choice made at that March meeting, written in tonnage. The railways got the lion's share of the weight, and the men who flew the missions spent the next year delivering it, so the order went out. And here the story leaves the conference rooms and goes up into the air, where young men who had never heard of Solly Zuckerman began to carry out a decision made far over their heads. The campaign opened in earnest in the spring. The heavy bombers went after the great yards, the British by night and the Americans by day, and the tonnage was staggering. By the morning of the invasion, the Allies had dropped roughly 76,000 tons of bombs on the French railways. In the valley of the Seine alone, in the weeks before and after the landings, something on the order of 22,000 aircraft sorties put more than 42,000 tons of bombs onto about 100 separate rail targets between Le Havre and Paris. The aim was to seal off the battlefield, to make it impossible for the Germans to feed the fight in Normandy by rail, and it worked. The effect on the ground was measurable in the most direct way possible. In early March of 1944, the German military rail system in northern France could move about 58,000 tons a day. By early May, after 2 months of this, that capacity had been cut to 25,000 tons a day, less than half. And the invasion had not even begun. The cost Churchill had feared was paid, and the script will not pass over it. The bombing fell on French towns, whose only crime was to have a rail yard at their centre. Places like Caen and Saint-Lô and Virey were wrecked, and French families died in numbers that climbed into the tens of thousands across the campaign. This is part of the record, and the men who flew the missions were not blind to it. They flew them anyway, because the alternative was a German army able to move freely against the beachhead, and the calculation made at Eisenhower's headquarters was that the cost in French lives now was the price of fewer American and British and French lives later. It is a hard calculation to write down in plain words. It was harder to make. But it was made deliberately by men who knew what they were choosing, and an honest account does not hide it behind the language of precision and surgical strikes. But the heavy bombers were a blunt instrument, and the most elegant work was done by a smaller aircraft and a smaller idea. The bridges were the choke points. A marshalling yard could be patched in days, but a bridge over a wide river was a different problem, and the Seine bridges in particular were the gates through which German supply had to pass. For a time, the planners assumed that knocking down a major rail bridge would take a saturation raid by heavy bombers, hundreds of aircraft and thousands of tons. Then, on May 7, 1944, 8 American P-47 Thunderbolts came in low against the 650-foot rail bridge over the Seine at Vernon. Each fighter carried 2 1,000-pound bombs. They put the bridge in the river. 8 aircraft, 16 bombs, 1 bridge, where the doctrine had called for an armada. It was a revelation. The fighter bomber, diving steeply and releasing late, could kill a bridge for a fraction of the cost in aircraft and crews. The Allies turned that lesson loose on every span the Germans needed. By the end of May, the airman Tedder could say, as the historian Rebecca Grant later recorded, that on the Seine routes not one train ran. The river line that the Germans had counted on as a supply artery had become a barrier in their own rear. This was the first kind of railway killing, the planned, deliberate destruction of fixed targets. There was a second kind, and it was wilder, more personal, and in its own way more terrifying to the men on the ground in field grey. It was called armed reconnaissance, and the men who flew it called it train busting. A flight of fighters would range out over occupied France or Western Germany with no fixed target at all, looking for anything that moved on the rails. A locomotive is a large, hot, fragile thing. A burst of 50 caliber fire into the boiler produces an enormous plume of white steam, visible for miles, and a dead engine blocking a single track can strand a dozen trains behind it. There was a doctrinal change behind this that came from the 8th Air Force commander, Lieutenant General James Doolittle, the same Doolittle who had led the carrier raid on Tokyo in 1942. Early in 1944, Doolittle changed the rules for his escort fighters. For a long time, the Mustangs and Thunderbolts had been chained to the bomber stream, forbidden to leave the formations they were guarding even when targets begged to be hit. Doolittle turned them loose. Once the bombers were safely on their way home, the escorts were told to come down to the deck and shoot up anything useful, and what was most useful was almost always on the rails. It was a controversial order at the time, because it meant accepting more losses among the fighter pilots, who were far more vulnerable down low than up high. But it transformed the American fighter force from a shield into a sword, and the German railway felt the change within weeks. The American Tactical Air Forces, the 9th Air Force above all, then made a science of it. Their fighter bombers cut the German rail lines at more than 1,000 points in the autumn of 1944, and destroyed something close to 1,000 locomotives in the same stretch. By daylight, a German engineer who lit his firebox was inviting a thunderbolt down on his head. The men who turned this into a system were the tactical air commanders, and several of them deserve their names spoken. The 9th Air Force, the tactical force that did most of the train busting over the front, had been led through the spring by Lieutenant General Louis Brereton, a Pittsburgh man, and one of the oldest hands in American military aviation. In August of 1944, Brereton moved up to command the Allied Airborne Army, and the 9th passed to Major General Hoyt Vandenberg, a Milwaukee officer still in his mid-40s, who would run the tactical rail campaign across France and into Germany for the rest of the war. Under them stood the men who actually directed the fighter bombers, and 2 of those deserve a closer look. Major General Elwood Quesada, a Washington man everyone called Pete, commanded the 9th Tactical Air Command in support of the 1st Army, and he was the most inventive air officer the Americans had on the Western Front. He took the radar sets built to warn of enemy aircraft and turned them around, using them to vector his own fighter bombers onto German trains and columns in something close to real time. He put Air Force pilots inside the lead Sherman tanks of armored columns with radios, so that the men in the air and the men on the ground were talking to each other directly. It was a quiet revolution in how air power and ground power worked together, and the railway was always near the top of the target list it produced. Alongside him, supporting Patton's Third Army, was Major General Otto Wayland, a Texan called Opie, of whom Patton said flatly that he was the best damn general in the Air Corps. These were not desk men. They built, week by week, the machine that found German movement and killed it. There was a stretch in the late summer of 1944 when the rail campaign almost seemed to vanish from the story, and it is worth understanding why, because it tells you something about how this kind of war actually works. After the American breakout from Normandy at the end of July, the front moved so fast that the wrecked French railways stopped mattering. The German army in the west was routed, the Allied armies were chasing it across France, and for a few heady weeks the problem was not German supply but Allied supply, the famous struggle to get fuel and ammunition forward to the racing American columns. The rail interdiction looked, for a moment, like yesterday's war. Then the front congealed at the German border in the autumn, the easy gains ended, and the deeper campaign against the German railway inside Germany itself moved back to the center of everything. The marshalling yards now were German yards, at Hamm and Cologne and Mainz and Saarbrücken and Kassel and a dozen other names, and the bombers came back to them again and again through the autumn and into the winter. It was not only the rails. The Germans had a second way to move heavy freight, the great inland canals that carried coal and ore on barges through the industrial West, and the Allies went after those too. In the autumn of 1944, the Dortmund-Ems and Mittelland canals, 2 of the most important water highways in Germany, were breached by bombing and drained, leaving barges sitting on mud. A waterway, like a railway, is only useful if it is whole, and a single well-placed cut can empty miles of it. Between the rails and the canals, the Allies were closing off every economical way the Ruhr had of sending its coal and steel to the front. What was left was the road, and the road belonged to the fighter bombers by day. There was, by the winter of 1944, almost no safe way for heavy German freight to move at all. The pilots who did this work were ordinary enough on the ground and lethal in the air. Consider one of them. On May 28, 1944, near Hasselt in Belgium, fighters of the 365th Fighter Group, a 9th Air Force outfit that called itself the Hell Hawks, came down on a rail bridge and found a German troop train parked beside it, loaded with artillery. First Lieutenant Neil Worley went after the locomotive. On his second pass, low and fast, he flew straight through the support cable of a railway water tower. 40 feet of half-inch steel cable wrapped itself around his propeller. He brought the shaking, half-wrecked P-47 home anyway. That was train busting. It was not glamorous. It killed a great many young men on both sides, and it never stopped. There is one American I want you to carry with you through the rest of this, because his life ties the whole story together in a way I did not expect when I started looking into it. His name was George Earl Preddy. He was born in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 5, 1919, the son of a Greensboro railroad man. There is a quiet symmetry in that fact that the war made cruel. The father gave his working life to the railroad on the ground. The son would spend his war taking railroads apart from the air, and then doing something even harder. Preddy was small, intense, and a magnificent pilot. He flew with the 352nd Fighter Group out of an airfield called Bodney in Norfolk, England, a unit whose blue-painted Mustangs earned them a nickname I will leave to your imagination. He came up first on the P-47 Thunderbolt, and then converted to the P-51 Mustang as the group did, and he started the war as a fighter pilot like any other, escorting the heavy bombers deep into Germany and strafing whatever offered itself on the way home. His encounter reports from the spring of 1944 are full of the ground war as well as the air war. On April 28, 1944, near Bourges in France, his flight came down on a locomotive and destroyed it, the kills shared among the four of them. In the days around the invasion, his squadron's records list locomotives and trains, trucks and buses, the daily grinding work of strangling German movement. He was a man who killed trains from the air, the son of a man who had spent his life running them on the ground, and I doubt the irony was lost on him. But Preddy's particular genius was for the air-to-air fight, and on one August morning he showed it in a way that put his name in the record books. On August 6, 1944, on a single sortie near Hamburg, Preddy shot down 6 German Messerschmitt 109 fighters. 6, in one flight, one of only a small handful of American pilots in the entire war ever to destroy that many enemy aircraft in a single day. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for it on August 12, 1944. By the autumn he had been given command of his own squadron, the 328th, and was on his way to becoming the highest-scoring American Mustang ace in the European theatre. Hold his name. We will come back to him, and the way we come back to him is not the way you would want. While Preddy and Worley and thousands like them worked the skies over the front, the deeper campaign ground on against the German rail system itself, and through the autumn and winter of 1944, it began to produce a result that no single raid could capture, but that the numbers make undeniable. To understand what was happening, you have to understand what the German railway was. The Reichsbahn was not a convenience. It was the circulatory system of the entire German war economy, something on the order of 68 to 70,000 kilometers of route, worked by more than 1.4 million people, and it carried one commodity above all others: coal. Roughly 40% of all the freight that moved on German rails was coal, and coal was everything. It made the steel, it fired the power plants, it heated the factories, and it even drove the locomotives that hauled the coal. That last point is the trap the Germans fell into. A coal-burning railway that runs short of coal cannot move the coal it needs to keep running. Damage the system far enough, and it does not simply slow down, it begins to eat itself. And the Western Front sat at the very end of that strained system, the last stop on the line, the place that got whatever was left after the factories and the cities and the power plants had taken their share. When the railway as a whole began to fail, the front felt it first and worst. A division holding the line in the Rhineland in the winter of 1944 did not need much imagination to understand the problem. It needed shells that were not arriving, fuel that was not arriving, and replacement vehicles that were sitting in yards 200 miles to the east with no way to come forward. Rundstedt was the man responsible for that front, and the failure of the railway was not an abstraction to him. It was the daily, grinding shortage of everything his soldiers needed to fight. The man who proved this with the railway's own records was an American historian named Alfred Mierzejewski, who went into the surviving files of the German Reich Transport Ministry after the war and reconstructed, week by week, how many freight cars the system was able to put on the rails. The figure is called car placement, and it is the single best measure of whether a railway is alive or dying. Here is what his work, drawn from the same data the wartime bombing survey had gathered, shows. In the week ending August 19, 1944, the German railway placed about 900,000 freight cars. That was the peak. By the last week of October, it had fallen to 700,000. By the week of December 23, in the middle of the Ardennes offensive, it was down to 550,000. And by the week of March 3, 1945, it had collapsed to 214,000. After that, the German records simply stopped being useful, because the system had broken down past the point where anyone could keep count. Sit with those numbers for a moment. From 900,000 to 214,000 in 7 months, a drop of more than 3/4. That is not a railway under strain. That is a railway in its death throes. And it was worst exactly where it mattered most, in the Ruhr, the industrial heart that fed the Western Front. In the Essen division of the railway, the place where the Ruhr coal began its journey, daily coal car placements ran at about 21,400 at the start of 1944. After the heavy autumn raids, they fell to 12,000. By January of 1945, they were down to 9,000. By February, they were, for practical purposes, 0. The coal stocks held by the railway itself tell the same story. 18 days of supply in October of 1944, 4.5 days by February. In some southern districts, less than a single day. When the coal stops, the steel stops. Ruhr steel production fell by about 80% between June and December of 1944. And here is the detail that captures the whole tragedy of the German position better than any other. German tank production actually reached its wartime peak in December of 1944, somewhere near 1,900 vehicles in that single month. A remarkable feat for a country under that much bombing, and it did not matter. Fewer than half of those tanks ever reached the frontline units that needed them, because the railway could no longer carry them there. They were built. They simply could not be delivered. A finished tank sitting in a factory yard at one end of a severed line, and a battlefield at the other, and nothing between them but broken track and burned-out locomotives. That is the engine of Rundstedt's complaint. He was not imagining it. The cord had been cut. Look for a moment at the Germans' own response, because it shows just how thoroughly they had been beaten on this ground. They were not passive. The Reichsbahn fought back with enormous energy, throwing repair crews at every break, rebuilding bridges, laying bypass track around smashed junctions, doing the patient, exhausting work of keeping a wounded railway limping forward. For most of the war, the Germans had been very good at exactly this, which was one of the oil men's arguments against the whole plan. But by the autumn of 1944, the breaks were coming faster than the crews could close them. A yard repaired one week was cratered again the next. And the effort itself was a kind of victory for the Allies, because the bombing forced Germany to divert an immense share of its war economy, something like 1/3 of it by some estimates, along with around 2 million workers, into air defense and into clearing and repairing what the bombs had broken. Every man filling a crater near Cologne was a man not building a tank or loading a shell. The campaign hurt Germany, even in the places where it appeared to fail. The American economists and officers of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, who walked into the ruins in the summer of 1945 to measure what the bombing had actually done, reached a conclusion they stated without hedging. The attack on transportation, they wrote, was the decisive blow that completely disorganized the German economy. That is a careful institution choosing a very strong word, decisive. And it was not a word the survey reached easily, because the men who wrote the report did not all agree, a point I will come back to, because the disagreement is part of the honest story. Many of you watching have a man in this war of your own, and the rail war drew in more men than the famous battles ever did, the pilots and the bomber crews and the ground crews who kept them flying. If your father, your grandfather, an uncle or a brother served, put his name in the comments below, his branch and his unit and his theatre, if you know them. These men are slipping out of living memory faster than most people realize, and a name written down is a name kept. The final act played out along the Rhine itself in the first months of 1945, and it had 2 parts, one Allied, one strangely German. The Allied part was the deliberate severing of the last crossings, and it built on a year of work against the wider system. By this point, the fuel campaign and the rail campaign were tearing at Germany together, each making the other worse. German aviation gasoline output from the synthetic plants, which had run at about 175,000 tons in April of 1944, had been driven down to about 30,000 tons by July and to roughly 5,000 tons by September, a fall of better than 90% in 5 months. A Luftwaffe that cannot fuel its fighters cannot contest the sky, and a railway that cannot run cannot carry the fuel that does exist to the units that need it. The 2 collapses fed on each other. In late February, the campaign against the rails reached a crescendo with an operation that committed something close to 9,000 Allied aircraft on February 22 and 23, 1945, against more than 200 transportation targets spread across western Germany. This one went after not just the great cities but the small junctions and the country stations that had been spared until then, the little nodes that the Germans had been using to route traffic around the wrecked main lines. The fighters alone claimed nearly 600 locomotives and more than 3,800 railcars in those 2 days. The cost was real. 90 Allied bombers did not come home. Then there were the bridges that would not fall. The viaduct at Bielefeld carried the main line east, and it had absorbed more than 50 raids and over 3,000 tons of bombs without coming down. On March 14, 1945, the British brought a new weapon to it, a 22,000-pound bomb called the Grand Slam, designed not to strike the bridge directly, but to bury itself deep in the earth alongside and bring the ground down underneath the piers. One Grand Slam and a string of its smaller cousins dropped about 100 yards of the viaduct into the valley. The Allies dropped more than 40 of those enormous bombs in the following weeks, walking down one stubborn bridge after another across western Germany. Even the smaller crossings were not spared. The great railway bridge at Wesel, near the mouth of the Ruhr, came down in this period, and the town around it was left more than 90% destroyed by the bombing that preceded the Rhine crossing there. By the 1st of March 1945, of the 25 railway bridges that crossed the Rhine, only 4 were still standing. And here is the strange German part of the ending. Those last 4 did not all fall to bombs. Most of the final Rhine crossings were blown up by German engineers themselves, on orders, to keep the Americans from using them, because the Germans could no longer hold the West Bank and were trying to wall themselves off behind the river. The most famous of them, the Ludendorff Railway Bridge at Remagen, the Americans seized intact on March 7, 1945, in one of the luckiest strokes of the war, when a German demolition charge failed to bring it down. It held just long enough to pour 6 divisions across, then collapsed on March 17 under the strain and the cumulative battering, killing 28 American Army engineers who were working to save it, and wounding 93 more. By the middle of March, there was no rail bridge standing across the Rhine. Rundstedt's grim sentence had become, almost exactly, the literal truth. Now I want to be honest with you about that sentence, because this channel does not exist to flatter anyone, including the men who flew for our side. When Rundstedt said it had become impossible to move a single train across the Rhine, he was exaggerating, and a careful viewer should know it. Trains did still cross, in dwindling numbers, into the early days of March. The 4 bridges that stood on the 1st of the month carried what little traffic the Germans could still organize. So as a flat statement of fact, his words go a step too far. But as a description of the operational reality, they are essentially correct. By February of 1945, sustained, useful rail supply across the Rhine had effectively ceased. The Ruhr coal was no longer reaching the front in any volume that mattered. The marshalling yards on the east bank were being broken faster than crews could repair them, and any train that tried to run in daylight was hunted. Rundstedt was a soldier giving a soldier's summary, not a statistician filing a return. The summary was right even where the arithmetic was loose. There is a second honesty I owe you, and it cuts against the simple version of this story. This was not an American achievement alone, and it was not bloodless. The heaviest single bombs that finally broke the Rhine bridges were British. The night campaign against the German yards was flown by British crews alongside the American daylight forces, and the original idea had come from a British scientist serving a British air marshal. This was a coalition that broke the German railway, and any telling that hands the whole thing to one nation is selling you a flag rather than the truth. And the cost was paid in large part by people who never wore any uniform. The transportation plan that sealed off Normandy killed French and Belgian civilians in the thousands, families who lived beside the very yards that had to be destroyed. The total French civilian dead from Allied bombing across the war ran past 68,000. Inside Germany, the figures were larger still. Hundreds of thousands of civilians killed by the bombing as a whole. American commanders knew exactly what they were ordering. Before the Great February operation against the German junctions, the American General Ira Eaker warned Karl Spaatz in writing that the attack would convince the Germans they were fighting barbarians and that of all the people killed in it, more than 95% could be expected to be civilians. He was not refusing the order. He was making sure the record showed that he understood it. I think that warning, preserved in the files, is one of the more honourable moments in the whole campaign, precisely because it does not pretend the thing was clean. So how did Rundstedt himself come to understand what had happened to him? The answer is that he understood it perfectly, and earlier than most. He had felt it from the very beginning. The historian who reads the German records finds Rundstedt and his subordinates complaining about Allied air power over the rails from the spring of 1944 onward, when he was forced to pull tens of thousands of construction workers off the Atlantic Wall, 18,000 of them in April alone, and 10,000 more in May, just to keep the French railways patched together. Think about what that means. The same enemy that was about to land on his beaches was already reaching deep into his rear and forcing him to cannibalize his own coastal defenses simply to keep the trains running. He was fighting a war in which his supply lines were being dismantled behind him by an enemy he mostly could not see and could not reach. By the spring of 1945, the German armaments minister, Albert Speer, was telling Hitler the same thing in writing. In a memorandum in the middle of March, Speer warned that the German economy faced inevitable collapse within a matter of weeks, and the reason at the center of his warning was the one at the center of Rundstedt's, the railways and the coal they could no longer move. Speer had every reason to blame the bombing rather than his own ministry, and a careful listener keeps that in mind. After the war, he spent days with his American interrogators going through the bombing in detail, a session he himself described as a kind of school, and he was happy throughout to lay the collapse at the door of the Allied air forces rather than at his own. But the railway data does not depend on Speer's word. It came from the railway's own files, and it said exactly what he said. The most self-interested witness and the coldest set of numbers agreed. Historians have argued ever since about how to rank the causes, and the argument started inside the American bombing survey itself. The division that studied oil concluded oil was decisive. The division that studied transportation, and the economists who studied the overall effect on the German economy, concluded transportation was decisive. One of those economists was John Kenneth Galbraith, who later wrote that he had to defend the survey's transportation findings against pressure from the Air Force with, in his words, a maximum of arrogance and a minimum of tact. The disagreement never fully resolved. Some later historians, like Mierzejewski, put the destruction of the railway first and call it the decisive factor. Others, like Richard Overy and Tammy Davis Biddle, argue that the rail campaign and the oil campaign cannot really be separated, that they work together with the broader weight of the bombing to grind Germany down. I lean toward the second view. The thing that broke Germany was not any single target system, but the whole crushing weight of the air war, and the railway was where that weight finally came to rest. And nearly all of them arrive at the same underlying point, which Rundstedt himself seems to have grasped in captivity. The three things he named, the air, the fuel, and the rails, were never really three separate causes. They were one machine. Allied command of the air, won in that bloody week in February of 1944, made the rail and oil campaigns possible at all. The loss of fuel meant the Germans could not truck their way around the broken rail lines. And the broken rail lines meant that what little fuel, and what few tanks, Germany still produced, could not reach the men who needed them. Cut any one strand and the others pulled tighter. The Americans and the British cut all three. If this story has held your attention to the end, a like and a subscription help more than you would think, and they cost you nothing. I want to leave you back where we started, with the old field marshal in the captured house at Bad Tolls, because there is one more thing in his testimony worth holding on to. When a man like Rundstedt, a Prussian of the old school who had spent his entire adult life around armies, sat down to explain his defeat, he did not talk first about the courage of the American infantry or the genius of any one general. He talked about logistics. He talked about the dull, unglamorous, decisive fact that an army that cannot be supplied cannot fight, and that the Americans and their allies had taken his supply away one bridge and one marshalling yard and one locomotive at a time. And the men who did it were not, for the most part, famous. They were pilots like Neil Worley, who flew a wrecked Thunderbolt home with a steel cable wound around his propeller. And they were men like Major George Earl Preddy of Greensboro, North Carolina, the railroad man's son, who flew the rail war and the air war both. Preddy did not live to see the railways finally break. On Christmas Day, December 25, 1944, in the middle of the Ardennes battle, he chased a German fighter down low over the front near Langevay and was killed, not by the enemy, but by American anti-aircraft gunners on the ground who did not recognize his Mustang in the confusion of that desperate week. He was 25 years old. He had destroyed nearly 27 enemy aircraft in the air, more than any other American Mustang pilot in the European theater, along with a string of trains and trucks on the ground, and he was brought down by his own side on a clear winter morning. His younger brother William, also a Mustang pilot, would be killed over Czechoslovakia the following April. The two of them lie side by side today in the American cemetery at Saint-Avold, in France. That is the war as it actually was, not as the movies tell it. It does not always let the best men finish their work, and it does not always spare the families that gave more than one son. But the work got finished, by the ones who came after him, and the proof of it is in the words of the enemy. Rundstedt said it himself, sitting in defeat with nothing left to gain by flattery. The root of the whole trouble was air power, and the thing that air power finally did to him was take the trains away. By the end, he could not move a single one across the Rhine. Their names belong in the record. That is why we tell these stories.